I'm Natalia Ortiz, and this is Currents. The swollen Mississippi River threatens flooding of biblical proportions. Plus, peace between Muslims and Christians is shattered in post-Mubarak Egypt after fatal clashes in Cairo leave 12 dead and churches destroyed. And it was a day of prayer for black vocations and priests.
We're here at a prayer service, a holy hour for vocation, and so we can pray for our priests, our seminarians, and for our future priests.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. Matt McClure has the night off. Floodwaters continue to rise in the South, forcing thousands of families from Arkansas to Tennessee to abandon their homes and seek emergency shelter. It's an especially critical day in Memphis as the bloated Mississippi River crests to its highest levels in decades. Residents who have been spared the ravages of the flood so far are now preparing for the worst. Holly Furfer is in Memphis with the latest.
The Mississippi began cresting in Memphis Tuesday morning. The river is expected to reach 48 feet, its highest level since 1937.
Never ever seen the water this high. Probably never will again.
President Obama signed a disaster declaration for Tennessee Monday, making federal aid available to the areas affected. Floodwaters have already swamped some Memphis neighborhoods and forced hundreds from their homes. As the water continues to rise, some residents are hopeful they'll have a narrow escape.
It wants to come up here, but I've been praying every day it don't, because I got 3 kids and I am not ready to move out my house because of this.
Further south, the Army Corps of Engineers opened the Bonnie Care Spillway Monday in hopes of averting similar destruction. The river is not expected to crest in Louisiana until next week. Governor Bobby Jindal is already advising residents in his state to be prepared.
Now it is certainly not too soon for people to look at those maps, and if you live within those areas, now's the time to be going out there and securing your property, making evacuation plans, thinking about where you might want to go.
The flooding has been partly caused by a 2-week period of torrential rain that brought 600% more precipitation than usual. Hot, relatively dry weather is expected for the rest of the week. A bit of good news for the home of the Blues.
That was Holly Furfer. To learn more about the situation in Memphis and its impact on the church, I'm joined by Suzanne Aviles, Director of Communications for the Diocese of Memphis. Suzanne, thank you for joining us.
Oh, certainly.
Suzanne, tell me, what have you seen in your area?
Since our diocese covers about half the state of Tennessee, we've seen a variety, mostly along the river, of course. Mississippi's affected towns at the Kentucky border all the way south to the Mississippi border. We've had only a couple of our schools affected in the city, but diocesan-wide, we're very grateful because could have been so much worse. We've only been displaced by about 100 students not being able to go to school. So our portion of the overall population has not been too bad.
Okay. Now, you're at 47.87 feet from what I've read earlier today. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And how is the Diocese of Memphis helping people to get through this or to avoid making this more of a catastrophe?
We got active about a week ago with Catholic Charities and started collecting supplies. So far, so good. We've been able to offer more help than we've needed to receive more help. And so we've been able to offer consumables, food, diapers, those kinds of things that the area shelters have needed. Apparently there's about 1,000 people that are in the area shelters and somewhere around 5,000 who've been displaced overall that through Catholic Charities, we can give them some help with the food and clothes and things that they've had to leave behind or lose.
Right. Suzanne, what are some of the things that they're missing the most? Or what are they most in need of, would you say?
Mostly in need of such things as shampoo and, things to immediately feed small children, things like formula, and then we've even needed adults, Depends and that sort of thing, because there have been people who are not completely ambulatory who've been misplaced.
Correct. So what can somebody do, Suzanne, if they'd like to help? Would you suggest they send money or they send things through a specific organization?
Well, right now the local shelters are pretty well stocked. So Catholic Charities is suggesting that people help through financial donations. And there are 3 ways to do that. If you go to our website, www.cdom.org, there's a link that explains how you can help. But it does go into PayPal as an option, texting $10 donations through your phone, and then making checks payable to Catholic Charities of West Tennessee.
West Tennessee. So again, I'm going to repeat that website for people who didn't catch it. It was www.cdom.org, and I'm assuming that stands for Catholic Diocese of Memphis?
That's right.
Okay, so cdom.org for anybody that'd like to help. Thank you so much for being with us today, Suzanne. Stay tuned. There's more currents straight ahead. Coming up next, violence between Muslims and Christians flares in Egypt again.
The Christian population, it is very much a battle for survival. They are a minority, and they do face the pressures of the government around them as well as society.
Welcome back to Currents. I'm Natalia Ortiz. All eyes may have been on Pakistan for the last week since news of the death of Osama bin Laden. But there's a deadly situation brewing in Egypt, where this weekend Muslims and Christians clashed. CNN's Ben Wiedemann has more on that.
A Cairo church in flames, an apt metaphor perhaps for the sectarian tensions threatening Egypt. In the crowded working-class neighborhood of Imbaba, hundreds of people described as Salafis, adherents of a strict interpretation of Islam, marched Saturday on the St. Minas Coptic Christian Church, where they alleged a Christian woman married to a Muslim man was being held against her will. What ensued was some of the worst sectarian violence the Egyptian capital has seen. Medical sources say at least 12 people were killed, Christians and Muslims, and more than 200 wounded. There were various kinds of injuries, recalls Dr. Hussam ad-Din al-Hazik, who treated the wounded, from sharp objects, from gunshots, from blunt instruments like sticks. The day after, emotions were still running high. Soldiers were trying to keep the crowds away. Coming. Did not take kindly to the CNN crew. Outside the U.S. Embassy, a small group of cops accused the government of inaction and called for protection from abroad.
I mean, we're hoping that, some international conscience would stand up and say what happened in Egypt for those Coptics, it's not fair and it's not right.
Heated, though peaceful, debate flared between Muslims and Christians, though some predictably pointed fingers elsewhere. What happened yesterday in the church was not from the Muslims, says Salah, a Muslim himself, but rather only God knows, maybe from America and Israel, because they want to destroy the Arab nation. In recent years, violence against Egypt's Christian minority has been on the rise. During the days of the Mubarak dictatorship, sectarian tensions were kept under control. But now, without the heavy hand of the state, those tensions are coming to the fore.
That's CNN's Ben Wiedemann, and a Catholic church in that city was also attacked. An Italian missionary told the Vatican news agency Fides that members of the Islamic Salafi movement rushed into the church with guns blazing, killing one man. Meanwhile, Asia News reports that a spokesman for the church in Egypt is calling on the international community to step in to prevent an Islamic regime from taking power. Egypt is, of course, no stranger to sectarian violence. Joining me to talk more about that and the latest news from Egypt is Edward Clancy of the Catholic Charity Aid to the Church in Need. Edward, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Edward, would you say that Catholics and Muslims in Egypt are at odds now? I mean, after being having united forces during the ouster, or immediately before the ouster of Mubarak, it seems that they had united. Is that not the case now?
I think there was a hopeful alliance, at least hopeful from the point of view of the Christian minority. I do think now that there are a lot of strains, there are a lot of pressures being put upon them from within and without that could be destroying that union.
Okay, and aside from just being kind of a battle of faiths, perhaps, is it also political? Is there a battle about the fate of Egypt as a state?
I think very much, or at least, well, to speak of the Christian population, it is very much a battle for survival, because they are a minority and they do face the pressures of the government around them as well as society. So there's a great challenge.
What do you think would happen to Christians in Egypt if Egypt became a religious state?
We could see, like has happened in a lot of northern African countries, in that it would go from a minority to a very, very small minority. There would be a great exodus, much of like what is happening in Bethlehem and other places in Palestine, where they might have occupied, may have made up about 40% of the population. They're dwindling down to less than 10. And in Egypt, there's a strong core of 10%. They may diminish to much lower.
I see. And of all the challenges facing Egypt right now, with being in this kind of gray stage in between, do you think that this violence perhaps is an obstacle or will deviate them from the path to democracy?
I think there's an element of intimidation in that the radical elements within the society want to pressure the Christians from voting as a bloc, want to keep them from gaining any power in the future parliament. One of the big concerns was in the recent referendum in March was how quickly the Constitution would be written, who would have control of the writing of the Constitution, and how it would be implemented. Aside from the fact that the elections would happen very quickly, which would give much more strength to the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafi and other organizations like that, which are already coalesced to take a greater portion of the power away from the rest.
I see.
So.
I wanted to know, what does your organization, your Director of Outreach and Evangelization for Aid to the Church in Need, so what does your organization do to help Christians and Catholics in the areas of Egypt and the Middle East?
In something like the case which just happened, that there were a couple of churches that were attacked or bombed. I mean, direct aid might be to support the rebuilding of those churches. There might be support of the Christian community within there. It might also be education. Something that very few people know is that something like 50% of all of the children in Catholic schools are Muslim.
Really?
Yeah. So
in Egypt.
In Egypt. Yeah.
Okay.
So
why? I'm sorry to interrupt. But why is that?
Well, there's a difference in opinion, I guess you would say, between the Islamic society and Christian society. Education in higher levels is very much valued in Christian society. In Islamic society, it's valued, but generally it's seen as something for only very few, whereas Christians tend to think more educate everyone, and they're very welcoming of other ones. So whereas Christians can come to a Christian school and so can Muslims, Christians would not be welcome into Muslim schools.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time, Edward, but thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
There is much more currents ahead. When we return, is a once thriving religious order on the brink of extinction? We'll have that story and the rest of the day's headlines next. Welcome back to Currents. Coming up in just a bit, ahead of this year's ordination of priests, what's being done to foster vocations in one of Brooklyn's thriving communities? But first, let's have a look at the day's headlines. The latest warning about global warming is coming from the Vatican. A Vatican-sponsored group says individuals and nations have a responsibility to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and put policies in place to combat global warming. In a report released by the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, the group says the cost to address these issues pales in comparison to what would happen if nothing was done. Meanwhile, the future of a once thriving religious order hangs in the balance. The head of the Christian Brothers tells Catholic News Service that costly sex abuse settlements have taken their toll on the congregation. Last month, the Christian Brothers sought bankruptcy protection amid a growing number of abuse claims. When the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy is officially lifted, Navy chaplains will be allowed to perform same-sex weddings. According to a preliminary plan, the chaplains will be allowed to marry same-sex couples, but only in states where those unions are legal. The chaplains will also have the power to refuse to perform the service based on their religious beliefs. The latest data on priesthood ordination shows the newest priests are getting younger. According to a new survey from a Georgetown-based research center, more than half of this year's ordination class is between 25 and 34 years old. a continuing trend over the last 5 years of younger ordination classes. The data also showed a majority of this year's ordination class, 69% in fact, is white. Hispanics make up the next largest percentage in this year's class with 15%. And all eyes will be on Madrid this summer as Catholics travel from 170 countries to gather there for World Youth Day. According to the latest numbers, 340,000 people have signed up so far. Italy, Spain, France, the US, and Germany have the highest number of pilgrims. World Youth Day will take place August 16th through the 21st. Events will include a vigil and Mass with Pope Benedict. After 25 years of marriage, Arnold Schwarzenegger and his wife Maria Shriver have announced their separation. Schwarzenegger and Shriver are both Catholic. Shriver comes from one of the most prominent Catholic political families. She is the daughter of late Kennedy's sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver and former Peace Corps director Sergeant Shriver, who died this past January. Schwarzenegger is an actor and former two-term governor of California. Stay tuned, there's more currents ahead. When we return, celebrating the ordination of Augustine Tolton, America's first black priest and would-be saint.
On the anniversary of Father Augustine Tolton, we're really praying for our priests and religious who works in the black community.
Finally, earlier this year, the Archdiocese of Chicago introduced the sainthood cause for Father Augustus Tolton, the first black priest ordained in the U.S. And it was quite a journey for Tolton, whose family went from slavery in Missouri to freedom and a better life in Illinois. This past Saturday at St. Benedict the Moor Church in Jamaica, the Vicariate of Black Catholic Concerns for the Diocese of Brooklyn took the opportunity to celebrate Tolton's life and legacy and pray for future vocations in the black community on the 125th anniversary of his ordination.
Today is a National Day of Prayer for Vocation in the Black Catholic community. And so here at St. Benedict the Moor, one of the first black churches in the Diocese of Brooklyn, we're here at a prayer service, a holy hour for vocation. And so we can pray for our priests, our seminarians, and for our future priests.
We are here to pray for vocation. And the greater part of this hour that we spend is in prayer. We pray that we will have more people who will respond to their vocations. I think we have a few vocations, but when we look at the population of Catholics, we certainly do not have enough. The culture is not conducive to the gospel values. If the culture denies God or rejects God, and is a culture kind of looks down upon the values of self-denial, of gratuitous love, and the culture fosters profit and pleasure, then it's going to be difficult to have vocations. Augustine Tolton was a black boy, rather poor, and he felt the call, and he responded, and it was very difficult. But finally he made it. He was sent to study in Rome, and he is the first African-American priest who was ever ordained in the United States.
We're definitely praying for all priests and religious, but in a special way, on the anniversary of Father Augustine Tolton, we're really praying for our priests and religious who works in the black community.
If I go and speak to a black audience, my witness might have special resonance to them. A priest, being more deeply aware of the culture and of the history of the particular ethnic group, can be closer to them and be a better witness of the gospel. Because the gospel is one, but the gospel must always be expressed through culture. Father, you called Augustine Tolton, call many among the black Americans, so that they will follow you and be true witnesses, and help them to be faithful to their vocation, not to give up halfway, to stick to you until death. Father, call many to follow you.
That is all for this edition of Currents. Coming up tomorrow, the same-sex marriage debate returns to Albany. We'll hear from one group that made its voice heard on the state capitol. We'll have that and more tomorrow night on Currents. Until then, be sure to visit us online at currentsny.net. We're also on Facebook and Twitter. And if you have a question, comment, or story idea, email us. The address is dropusaline@currentsny.net. For all of us here at Currents, I'm Natalia Ortiz. Thanks for watching. Have a great night.